ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see so many smiling faces on this rainy, what I call infamous rite of spring, better known as IRS.
Thank you.
You can hear me? Shout. It's on. It doesn't reach that far. I'll elongate my neck. How's that? Okay, now I can't see what I'm reading. Dr. Harding, members of the council, guests, and friends, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, it is a great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the meeting of the council. I have the usual announcements to make. We would like to thank the Asia Society for making this evening's program possible. I think everybody had dinner, didn't they, with an egg roll? We also would like to thank the First National Bank of Maryland for sponsoring this evening's reception, and we also would like to thank the World Trade Center Institute for its support of this evening's program. As all of you know from media accounts, Ambassador Walters is in effect serving as ambassador at large as well as representative to the United Nations. In the former capacity, I regret to say, he will not be in the United States on April the 28th. The scheduled address will be announced as to who the replacement will be. We don't know at this time. Our next program, as you probably remember, is the Euro Group Panel on NATO, 24th of April. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. Harry Harding. China's potential economic and diplomatic role in the world fascinates observers and practitioners. How long the present bold course will be maintained, the look of China in the 21st century, and implications for the United States and the region of East Asia are questions of basic interest, but require complex and difficult analyses. In order to help inform us about today's China and its present and future impact on the United States and Asia, we are fortunate to be joined by a distinguished author on China and a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, Dr. Harry Harding. Dr. Harding received his A.B. in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University, his M.A. and Ph.D. in Political Science from Stanford University. He taught 1 year at Swarthmore College and for 12 years at Stanford before joining the Brookings Institution in the fall of 1983. Dr. Harding has also served as a visiting professor at the University of California, the Berkeley campus in 1977, and as coordinator of East Asia program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He is a prolific writer. He's the editor of China's Foreign Relations in the 1980s, the author of Organizing China, The Problem of Bureaucracy, China and the U.S., Normalization and Beyond, and numerous other works on U.S.-Asian relations, Chinese domestic politics, and Chinese foreign policy. He is presently completing a book tentatively entitled China's Second Revolution, Political and Economic Reform in Post-Mao China. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Harding to the Council to speak on the theme, China Awakes, Implications for the United States and Asia. Dr. Harding.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. And I say that in particular as one who served for a number of years in the capacity of a member of the board of directors of your sister organization, the World Affairs Council of Northern California. So it always gives me great pleasure to come to a World Affairs Council to address audiences such as these, because I think they are a particularly vibrant part of the American community on international affairs. It gives me also great pleasure to come back to Baltimore again. Someone asked me during the cocktails if I had been here before, and my initial answer, which was quite honest and correct, was that anyone who is the father of a 5-year-old boy, as I am, comes to Baltimore quite often, if only to go to the B&O Railroad Museum, the Science Museum, the aquarium, the power plant, and this whole complex around this magnificent harbor. But whatever the original motivation, one comes back to Baltimore because it truly is one of, I think, America's most exciting cities in terms of its ability to restore and revitalize some marvelous historic communities, and it's one that gives me particular pleasure to see is adopting an increasingly international outlook. So it's a particular pleasure for both these reasons to be here tonight. As you've heard, and as you've seen from the materials that were sent out to you in preparation for this talk, the title of my presentation this evening is China Awakes. A kind of cute title like that, I think, deserves a little bit of explanation before we proceed, because it gives, of course, the background for what I will be analyzing tonight. What do we mean when we say that China is awakening in the post-Mao era? We mean, first of all, that China today is now committed to establishing as its principal priority economic development and modernization, rather than, as during most of the Maoist period, having economic development compete for the attention of national leaders with the goals of revolutionary change at home and revolutionary transformation abroad. This establishment of economic development as China's principal goal is, I would argue, unique for China, unique in the history of China. In the past, no other leadership was able to establish effectively modernization as China's principal priority, either because they were unable to establish themselves in power, and here I would point, for example, to the regime of Chiang Kai-shek on the Chinese mainland in the 1930s and 1940s, or because, while they established themselves in power, they were constantly distracted by the goal of revolution, as was the case during the time that Mao was in charge of the Chinese Communist movement. For the first time since 1800, therefore, we have in power now an effective leadership supported by a reasonably effective bureaucracy that seems to be committed to the task of the modernization of the economy and the society of the world's most populous nation. That in itself is a very historic development. But of course, when we say China awakes, we go beyond that to a second point. And that is that as a strategy of modernization, that is, as a means of achieving the goal that I've just mentioned, China has embarked upon a relatively liberal path for a communist regime. That is to say, it is adopting a reform-minded strategy that gives the Chinese society relatively more autonomy from the state, Chinese governmental institutions relatively more autonomy from the party, the Chinese economy relatively greater freedom from the plan, and intellectual inquiry and political discourse relatively greater freedom from doctrine. These changes do not, and I emphasize do not, turn China today into a capitalist country, into a market economy, or into a pluralistic or democratic system. But they do represent a substantial change from the policies and structures of the past, and they do point China down a road of liberalization, the termination point of which is by no means clear. Now, the continuity of these recent developments, of course, is open to question. China may have embarked upon a course of liberalization and may have adopted economic modernization as its principal goal, but there's no way of knowing with any certainty whether or not these will survive the death of Deng Xiaoping, a man who is now in his early 80s. We saw Mao Zedong, at a comparably late stage in his life, try to set an equally bold and visionary course for his country. A course, of course, that represented revolution rather than modernization, and totalitarianism rather than any degree of liberalization. we saw Mao devote an enormous amount of his time and energy to grappling with the problem of how he could make sure that vision survived his own inevitable death. We saw that vision survive for about 1 month after Mao died, at which time his wife, his widow, and 3 of her closest advisors, the so-called Gang of Four, were purged from office. Within a few more years, we saw a man that Deng had criticized very vociferously during the Cultural Revolution, namely Deng Xiaoping, return to power. And by 1981, we saw the Chinese officially adopting a resolution on their country's history that was sharply critical of Mao's policies and decisions in his later years. So despite Mao's best efforts, continuity of his programs was abruptly shattered by his own physical departure from the Chinese political scene. Will Deng Xiaoping do any better? And I'm working on a whole book on this subject, and I can't give you all of my conclusions, but let me summarize them with the following points, which are going to serve as the kind of intellectual underpinning for my talk. Neither the continuation of modernization nor the continuation of the more specific reformist strategy is inevitable or certain in China. Nonetheless, I believe the chances of both are more than 50%. In particular, I would be extremely surprised if any successor leadership departs from the emphasis on economic development that Mao's successors have adopted for their country. I would be somewhat less surprised if they were to revise some of the more radical liberalizing reforms that Deng and his lieutenants have introduced. But even if they do, I see very little likelihood of a return to any version of Maoist policies and programs. In short, there has been, I think, a fundamental realignment in Chinese politics, a fundamental change in the Chinese political spectrum, so that the choice now is between continuation of liberalizing reform on the one hand and a return to a modified version of a more orthodox Soviet model on the other. And the option that dominated China for the 20 years, from 1957 to 1976, of a revival of revolutionary utopianism, that option, I think, has been virtually completely precluded. Now, if this analysis is correct, and of course it can be questioned, but I'm going to assume for the sake of my presentation tonight that it is correct, what then are the implications? It seems to me that the way to proceed, therefore, is to assess somewhat separately the issue of the impact of China's new commitment to modernization, on the one hand, and then the additional question of what difference it makes whether China within that context adopts a reform-minded strategy or returns to a more orthodox approach. What we'll see when we take this approach to the analysis of the problem is that the commitment to modernization has already made a fundamental impact on China's foreign relations, and therefore will continue to do so. The further impact of reform is much more important for some international issues than for others. It makes a great deal of difference, in my opinion, for the international economy and for the questions of Taiwan and Hong Kong, whether China continues on a reformist course or whether it retreats somewhat. It makes relatively less difference for the issue of China's position in the broader geopolitical context, whether China continues in reform-minded directions or not. Let me develop this general theme first by drawing some general conclusions about the implications thus far of China's new emphasis on modernization, and then deal more specifically with a number of particular issues. Taiwan and Hong Kong, the so-called irredenta question, the question of reunifying China. Secondly, China's role in the international economy. Thirdly, China's role in the global strategic balance. And finally, China's modernization and its implications for the Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc. Then I will conclude with a few final thoughts on the implications of all of this for us here in the United States. What then are the general implications of China's modernization emphasis for China's foreign relations? This is not a matter of guesswork, because we have seen now more than 7 years of history of a new Chinese foreign policy that stems to a very large measure from the emphasis that Chinese leaders domestically have placed on domestic economic modernization. Unfortunately, however, the record, while very clear, is somewhat mixed, somewhat contradictory. And as you'll see in a few minutes, this contradiction explains the deeply rooted ambivalence and uncertainty about the future of China that one encounters wherever one goes throughout the rest of East Asia. In preparation for the project that the Asia Society is conducting on the evolution of Northeast Asia, of which I'm a part, the Asia Society sent a study group of about 7 people to all the capitals of Northeast Asia, with the single exception of North Korea, which would not give us visas, in October and November of last year. And on that trip, all of us were struck, among many other things, about the deeply rooted ambivalence, the sense of hope combined with apprehension about China that we encountered every step along the way. What this reflects is the contradiction between 2 elements. First, the way in which the new emphasis on economics at home is spilling over into an emphasis on economics in foreign affairs, and is therefore making China more interested in a stable and peaceful international environment. But secondly, the knowledge that China will, because of its modernization program, increasingly develop the military, political, and economic resources with which to play a major role in international affairs, and the sense that China is, like many other Asian countries, characterized today by a growing sense of nationalism, of self-confidence and self-assertiveness that could conceivably have disruptive consequences. Let me spell out each of these 2 points a little bit further. It is clear to begin with that China, abroad as at home, is placing ever greater emphasis on economics as the cornerstone of its foreign policy. There was reportedly a major meeting of Chinese ambassadors recalled to Peking to a conference on Chinese foreign affairs in which this point was spelled out explicitly by Chinese leaders, in which they said that our basic task at home is modernization, diplomacy should serve domestic policy, and therefore we must engage in what the Prime Minister in that conference described as economic diplomacy. What are the implications of this more specifically? First of all, China is engaged in a growing interaction with the world economy, not only in a quantitative sense, but also in a qualitative sense. The amount of trade, expressed as a ratio to China's overall GNP, has doubled from 1978 to 1984, rising from about 10% of GNP in 1978 to nearly 20% in 1984. Put in terms of exports as a ratio of GNP, the numbers are about half, predictably, from 5% to about 10%. At the same time, what has also been happening is not only is the volume of international economic relationships expanding, but also the quality, the variety, and the flexibility have all been increasing as well. Immediately after the death of Mao Zedong, the new leadership still announced that while it expected to increase trade with the rest of the world, it would never accept foreign loans. It would never allow the import of foreign consumer goods. It would never allow foreigners to invest in China. It would never allow foreigners to, as they're called, meddle in the management of Chinese enterprises, and so forth. Over time, steadily, one by one, these restrictions have all fallen, so that now China welcomes foreign investment, hires consultants from the overseas Chinese community and from the foreign communities to the Chinese national planning apparatus as a whole, right down to individual factories. It is engaged now in an aggressive attempt to find loans on the international financial market with the most favorable terms to China. It is still cautiously, but is doing it, importing consumer goods from abroad, so that the variety and the quality of the relationships that China is engaged in internationally in the economic sphere has been vastly increased. It's also clear that this growing interaction is not only expanding qualitatively and quantitatively, but also expanding in terms of the areas of the world in which China is interested. It is clear that while the Chinese are particularly interested in trade with the West and trade with the United States, access to American technology and American educational institutions in particular, there is no exclusive focus on any one group of countries. China still has a very active trading relationship with the third world, in which the surplus that it generates in its relations with the developing countries help pay for the deficit that it incurs in its technology imports from the developed world. And in the same way, the Chinese are increasingly interested in economic relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, both as a way of getting access to Soviet technology, which, while less advanced than Western technology, may in some ways be more suited to Chinese needs, and also access to the comparable reform experiments that have taken place in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Hungarian economy, which is in many ways quite similar to the economic structure the Chinese are attempting to create. This point that the Chinese are interested in forging an economic relationship with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe leads me to the second implication of the priority of economics in foreign affairs, and that is the growing separation of economics and politics. The interest in economic relationships with virtually everyone is reflected in a Chinese willingness to deal economically with nations with whom political relations are either very strained or non-existent. Thus, China has no diplomatic relations at all with South Korea because of its alliance with North Korea. It says that it will never be able to do so as long as the Korean question is not resolved. And yet, trade between China and South Korea has increased remarkably over the last 7 years, such that South Koreans are now actively investing through dummy corporations in Hong Kong in enterprises in southeastern China. Chinese relations with Indonesia, to cite a second example, remain very strained because of alleged Chinese involvement in a planned coup back 20 years ago in 1965 against the then, or at least part of the then ruling regime in Indonesia. And yet, once again, trade is proving to be a kind of a solvent in the relationship, as the Chinese and the Indonesians are beginning to grope toward at least a preliminary economic relationship. And in the same way, despite the fact that there remain considerable geopolitical obstacles to the improvement in Sino-Soviet relations, the Chinese are interested clearly in increasing their economic, scientific, and cultural exchanges with Moscow. And indeed, in a conversation just last week with an official of the Chinese embassy here in Washington, when I asked how one could explain this, he said, because we now separate economics and politics. He didn't put it quite that way. He said, to quote him exactly, because trade and politics are two different things. We can increase our economic relationships while political relationships remain relatively frozen. Thirdly, the emphasis on economics in foreign affairs and on economic development at home means that China does, genuinely I think, have a desire for a peaceful international environment. It does not want to be distracted by this pressing domestic task, by the need to devote either material or mental resources to the problem of dealing with a turbulent environment. This desire for a peaceful international environment is reflected in the improvement of relations with former adversaries, the Soviet Union, India being prime examples of this, with Vietnam being, to this point at least, the sole, although very important, exception. A growing Chinese interest in the management of regional conflicts, preventing them from breaking out into war or escalating from the level of conflict that already exists. Here, China's interest in maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula is perhaps the best example. The Chinese interest in seeing the United States and the Soviet Union have a more moderate and relatively more conciliatory relationship, a completely different position than the Chinese took even 10 years ago, when they were arguing that the United States should do more to stand up to the Soviet Union. Today, they say the United States should not do too much to create a tense or exacerbated relationship with Moscow. It's reflected also, and most directly, in the relatively modest pace of China's military modernization, the cutback of the size of the Chinese army by about 25%, and a clear attempt to minimize the disruptive impact that military development would have on the domestic economy. Finally, the priority given to economics in foreign as well as domestic affairs is reflected in a growing pragmatism and flexibility among Chinese leaders on a variety of international issues. If you talk to Chinese leaders today, either here in the States or in China, about foreign affairs, gone are the references to the global theories of the past. The theory of imperialism, the theory of the three worlds, the theory of people's war. Gone is the attempt to fit all international issues into an all-encompassing ideological framework. Instead, both in their written commentaries on international affairs and by example in their own discussions, Chinese leaders and analysts increasingly deal with issues on a case-by-case basis, sometimes coming to very different conclusions than we Americans would come to, but not basing their conclusions on a deduction from a formal ideological set of premises. We've also seen the Chinese become increasingly flexible on sensitive issues, including a growing flexibility in welcoming foreign investment and trade, a growing flexibility on the Hong Kong question, some flexibility on the Taiwan issue, and so forth. So this then reflects the first key impact of the emphasis on modernization, and that is a foreign policy that is increasingly pragmatic, increasingly flexible, increasingly interactive, increasingly interested in a stable international environment around China. Is there any precedent for this kind of foreign policy? Yes, there is. And indeed, the one that strikes me increasingly frequently is the comparison between Chinese foreign policy in the 1980s and Japanese foreign policy in the 1960s. There are major differences, of course, but in several areas there are very interesting parallels, resonances with the past. The Japanese were, of course, the people who first invented, so to speak, the theory and practice of the separation of economics and politics, believing that you can trade with anybody regardless of the state of formal diplomatic or political ties. In the same way, the Japanese also conducted a foreign policy which as late as the 1970s was described by one of our most distinguished Japan specialists as an omnidirectional peaceful coexistence policy, or as he then defined it in more familiar terms, be nice to everybody, because of the desire of Japan to have a peaceful international environment in which it could devote all of its energies to domestic modernization. And of course, we've seen how successful that policy was for Japan in the years since it was first implemented. Now, China is different from Japan, and I'm not saying that it is completely a carbon copy of the Japanese diplomatic experience, far from it. But the point is that we have seen before the results of an emphasis on economics in foreign affairs stemming from a priority to domestic modernization, and in many ways the Chinese foreign policy of the 1980s reflects that common Asian experience. On the other hand, secondly, a major subordinate theme, but one that has some troubling overtones or perhaps undertones to it, is the rise of nationalism in Chinese foreign policy. This is in some ways related to, a logical consequence of, some of the developments I've already mentioned, but it also runs against them in some intriguing ways. It's related to them because it stems in part from the growing pragmatism of Chinese leaders. Pragmatism means, of course, a doing away with ideology of doctrine, not only as a guide to action, but also ideology as a basis for the legitimacy of one's government in the eyes of one's people. The Chinese leadership is less and less saying to the Chinese people, support us because we believe in, we stand for a comprehensive, scientifically correct doctrine. Instead, they are saying, support us because you are Chinese and we are the government of China. Support us because we will build a strong and prosperous China. Perhaps the best example of this, and I wish I had been able to bring it here tonight, was a rather large poster that I collected in China some years ago that stood as a sharp contrast to the propaganda posters of the past. In the past, one would have a clearly demarcated group of people each representing a sector of a class-based society. So there'd be the worker, the peasant, the soldier, and depending on the political mood, the intellectual, who's always the one with the glasses on. And there would be some reference to communism, to Marxism, to the great, glorious, and correct Chinese Communist Party, and usually that would be reflected in some symbolism in the poster as well. The poster that I collected in 1982, if I remember correctly, in Shanghai, showed simply a couple of young Chinese, a man and a woman, dressed in Western clothes, no distinguishing class characteristics to them except that they probably were urban residents because of how they were dressed, gazing off kind of dreamily into the future, while behind them were the symbols not of communism but of modernization. Pictures of power, high-tension power lines, symbols of atomic nuclei, rocket ships going up, big factories belching out smoke, and the title, the caption of it said simply, 中国万岁, long live China. That was the full content and the message. And it's clear in that, kind of the juxtaposition of two posters, the change in ethos in the regime in China. Support us because we are Chinese and we are building a strong and prosperous China. Increasingly, too, it is reflected in the way in which Chinese leaders describe themselves in international affairs. In the mid to late 1970s, the argument was that China, A, was a member of the Third World, and B, would never ever be a superpower. Increasingly, the Chinese have modified each of those two statements. They continue to say that they will never be a superpower because a superpower is by definition bad. But they increasingly candidly say that their goal is to become a major power, a big force in international affairs by the early part of the next century. Increasingly, too, they talk in terms of China playing in a multitude of international arenas. Yes, they are still part of the Third World, but they are also a major international actor in a way that no other third world country can approach. So an article which concludes by saying that China is part of a third world that is playing a major force in international affairs can also have in its opening sections a description of China playing two very different roles. China as part of a strategic triangle linking the Soviet Union, the United States, and Peking, and China as part of what might be called a Western Pacific quadrangle, which adds Japan to the triangular equation. So in all these ways, both in terms of their comments to their own people and their comments to foreign countries, Chinese leaders are arguing that they are going to become a major force to be reckoned with in international affairs. What this suggests, and what bothers many Asians, of course, is the possibility that there will therefore be a rise of a nationalist, assertive spirit in Chinese foreign policy. A growing concern with the question of boundaries, many of which are still in dispute. A growing desire to reunify China under communist leadership, a leadership of Peking at least, which means has certain implications for the resolution of the Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan questions. A growing sense of economic nationalism, that the international environment is there to be used on China's terms, and a growing sense of strategic independence, of being a major power that is not aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. These two factors, the economic flexibility on the one hand and the growing assertive nationalism on the other, are not in direct conflict with one another, but they do provide a somewhat different degree of shading to our analysis of Chinese foreign policy. And these two factors in interaction explain why all around Asia one sees a blend of hope and concern about the awakening of China. On the one hand, there's an awareness that China's commitment to modernization is creating a desire in Peking for a more peaceful and prosperous international environment. Has the microphone gone out on me?
No.
Yes?
No.
Yes? Seems dead to me. I'll try to talk a little louder. Just went dead, okay? Now I will talk louder, which will be good news for you because I'll probably have to talk shorter if I talk louder. So there's the sense that Peking therefore desires a more peaceful and prosperous international environment, but at the same time a concern that success in modernization will give China greater material resources with which to pursue its goals in terms of economics, in terms of territory, and in terms of geopolitics. I think that one Japanese specialist on China put it best in summarizing the ambivalence that he, and by extension other Japanese, and by further extension other Asians, feel about China, when in answer to my question of what Japan's hope for China is, he answered, "We hope that China will continue to devote all of its energies to the task of domestic economic development. We also hope that it will never succeed." Now, unfortunately, this outcome, that it will try but not succeed, is not particularly likely. China was able, even with the irrationalities of the Maoist leadership and the inefficiencies of the Maoist leadership, to have growth rates on the order of 7% per year on the average. With more efficient strategies of economic development, there is absolutely no reason to believe that growth rates will fall below that. Indeed, there's every expectation that they will, at least in the short and middle run, rise above it. So it is absolutely impossible that China will continue to sleep. China will awaken, but will it shake the world when it does so, as Napoleon once predicted, or will it coexist peacefully with it? That's the question, of course, for us. Let me deal somewhat more briefly with some of the major issues that I see in Chinese foreign policy and show how the interaction of the issue of modernization as the broad priority and reform as the particular strategy interact. Let's take first the way in which China is dealing with the questions of Taiwan and Hong Kong. Here we see in very clear form the interaction between the positive, the negative, the flexibility and the assertiveness that is characteristic of Chinese foreign policy today. First of all, it seems to me that the rise of nationalism in Peking is increasing the salience of this issue of reunifying China to Chinese leaders. Since it is a given in Chinese history that the country is divided, it falls apart territorially, either part of it falling under the control of a separatist internal regime or falling under the control of avaricious foreign powers. These things happen only when China is weak. And when China becomes strong once again, it is the responsibility of that leadership, and indeed it is the measure of its strength, to reunify the country. So that this cycle of China cleaving asunder and coalescing is one of the most basic patterns in Chinese history, and it is believed to some degree to be a test of a leadership as to whether it can reunify the country after a period of disunity. In the same way, the growth of China's resources, political, economic, and military, will give China greater ability to affect the outcome. On the other hand, it is also clear in dealing with the Hong Kong and Taiwan issues, it is limited by its increasing stake in a peaceful economic environment, in gaining the greatest economic benefit from its relations with Taiwan and Hong Kong, and in maintaining good working relations with Japan and the United States, both of which, to different degrees of explicitness, have an interest in a peaceful future for Taiwan. And at the same time, the greater pragmatism of the Chinese leadership in the post-Mao era is leading to greater flexibility in the way in which they handle the Taiwan question. It seems to me that this question of Taiwan and Hong Kong is one issue on which, whether or not reform continues, it makes a major, major difference in China. If reform continues, it will narrow the gap, never resolving it, never eliminating it, but narrow the gap in standard of living, economic system, and social structure and style of life between particularly southeastern China and Hong Kong, and between China in general and Taiwan. It will increase the possibility that China will become ever more flexible in working out ways of nominal reunification while granting Hong Kong and Taiwan virtually complete autonomy, and more specifically means that Hong Kong will be better able to make the accommodations and the wise decisions necessary to ensure that the implementation of the Sino-British Agreement on the Future of Hong Kong of 1984, the implementation of that agreement goes successfully. On the other hand, if reform halts or retrogresses, then the gap in structure and system will remain wide. The chances for flexibility regarding Taiwan will be reduced. The temptation of the Chinese leadership to intervene in Hong Kong will increase, and there the possibility of a significant breakdown over the Hong Kong issue also increases. So in this issue, I see that in general, modernization points us in promising directions, but how promising they will turn out to be depends very much on whether reform continues or falls behind. In terms of the international economy, I reach very similar conclusions. Whether or not China adopts a reform-minded route or a more orthodox Soviet model, there will be a continued interest in foreign trade, a continued interest in the import of foreign technology, a continued interest in some form of scientific exchanges with the outside world. Unfortunately, at the same time, China will also continue to act as what I call a neo-mercantilist power. And again, the similarities with Japan are striking. That is, it will not engage in laissez-faire economics. Instead, it will engage in government-sponsored, government-promoted, and government-regulated international economic transactions with the rest of the world, so that the power of the Chinese state can be used in attempts to extract from the international community the most resources at the least cost to China, and the power of the state can be used to prevent the introduction into China of goods, ideas, or technologies, or institutions, or values that the Chinese party and government, in its wisdom, deem to be undesirable for China. So that again, there are two sides of this coin. One, the interest in international relations, but the growing ability to try to manage and promote this to serve the interests of the Chinese state in a collective sense. Here again, the impact of reform's continuity or abandonment is of fundamental importance. If reform continues, we will, I think, see a China that continues to be increasingly flexible in its international economic relationships, increasingly desirous of finding ways of facilitating international economic relations with the rest of the world, and therefore, especially in other developing countries, an increasingly effective economic competitor as well. In the same way, if China continues on the course of reform that has been sketched out over the last several years, possibly China will become a more avid borrower in international financial markets as well. In general, the continuation of reform, therefore, is in the interests of the United States economically. But we have to understand that this is also a fluid and risky environment for American businesses to operate in. Reform solves some problems, but it may increase others. It may lead the Chinese to create a more hospitable legal structure, a somewhat more flexible regulatory environment for American businesses. But at the same time, the uncertainties, the transitions, the false starts involved in reforming an economy of China's scale may mean a certain degree of risk and uncertainty with regard to everything from labor management practices onto the prices that firms will have to pay for inputs. The other side of the coin, if reform is reversed in China, it seems to me that, again, there will be a big impact on China's participation in the international environment, international economy. I would see a declining access to the internal Chinese market, tighter planning and thus greater difficulties in obtaining high-quality, reasonably priced raw materials from Chinese sources, a growing party activism in the management of joint ventures in China, greater restrictions on foreigners' flexibility in designing and implementing labor policies, perhaps some restrictions on the kind of foreign investment that is welcomed into China, and possibly even a termination of the controversial special economic zones, or at least a redefinition of their scope and their policy. Finally, let me turn to, in a sense, the opposite side of the spectrum, an area in which I think the future of reform makes relatively little difference, where the issue is really the continuation more broadly of a modernizing China, and that is the global balance. Modernization is going to give resources to China and kind of a psychological impetus of growing nationalism to adapt a relatively independent posture in foreign affairs. That is to say, China, as I see it, is not going to see it in its interest to align itself closely with either the United States or the Soviet Union. Independence remains a major goal of Chinese foreign policy, as it has been for centuries, and now growing, effective economic policies give China the resources to put that goal into practice, or that strategic focus of independence into practice. Only in relatively extreme circumstances, such as a major confrontation between the two superpowers, a major threat to China from one of them, would, I think, China see any temptation to adopt a policy of alignment such as we saw with the Soviet Union in the early 1950s or the United States in the late 1970s. I am confident more about this conclusion than any other I have reached in my talk. Modernization means an independent China, not a China that is allied with the United States. Will reform make a difference? Yes, it may, but only at the margin. It is true that if reform continues, there will be marginally more interest in the United States as a source of technology and a source of ideas about where China might go, and that this might be translated somewhat into a more favorable geopolitical posture with regard to the United States. The same way, a retreat towards the more orthodox Soviet model might, at the margin, somewhat incline China more towards the Soviet Union than towards the United States. But it seems to me that the degree of tilt within its independent foreign policy that China adopts is going to be much more a function of strategic and geopolitical factors than on domestic considerations. And that, again, to emphasize my major point, the main direction of Chinese geopolitics is going to be towards independence rather than alignment. Let me conclude. I promised some discussion about the Soviet Union, but I will skip over that and get right to the conclusion about the implications for the United States, which I think are the following. First of all, it means that in China we are going to face a challenge that we're going to face increasingly in Asia, and I think over the longer term in other parts of the region as well, and other parts of the world as well. And a challenge that we have not confronted effectively in the past, and that is the challenge of dealing with independent regional power. I was talking to a visitor from India about 2 or 3 weeks ago about why there were problems in Indo-American relations. And I said, what's the difficulty? Is it that we are allied with Pakistan? Is it that we do not fully appreciate the degree to which you are the largest democracy? Is it that we don't pay enough attention to India vis-a-vis China? What's the problem? And his answer was, all of those play a part, but none of them is the central issue. The central issue is that you have never respected our right and our decision to be an independent power. If we're not going to ally with the United States, you assume that means you are tilting towards the Soviet Union or allied with the Soviet Union. You have never respected our decision to be independent. China is making the same demand on the United States today, and we're going to have to learn how to cope with that. And it seems to me that this challenge will be repeated in decades to come by the Indonesias, by the Vietnams, by the Brazils, the Nigerias, just like the Indias of the 1950s. So we have a challenge of defining a working geopolitical relationship with a country that is not going to be our ally, but that still probably will find more in common with us geopolitically than with the Soviet Union. Will we develop the wisdom and the flexibility to manage this relationship over the long run successfully? Secondly, the implication is that as China emphasizes economics more in its foreign affairs, that economic issues in turn will become more salient in the U.S.-China relationship. And indeed, that already is the case. While there clearly are strategic elements to the relationships and a military component to the relationship, increasingly it is economics that provides the day-to-day meat, the day-to-day issues in U.S.-China relations. As I've argued a few minutes ago, the nature of those relationships will change somewhat whether reform continues or not. that in general reform will make China both a more effective competitor and also a more hospitable environment. The nature of the issue will therefore change somewhat, but I believe that a clear consequence of China's emphasis on modernization is the emergence of economic relations in our ties with China, as increasingly in our ties with so many other nations, as perhaps the most important element of both cooperation and competition and conflict in Sino-American relations. Finally, with regard to Taiwan, here it seems to me it is very much a matter of the extent to which reform continues. If reform continues, I believe there is a good chance that the Taiwan issue can be managed and that some ultimate resolution of the issue can be achieved sometime in the next century. Notice that I am not predicting what that resolution will be, because I think it is premature to do so, but that a more prosperous and liberalized, flexible China, I think, is the key to the resolution of the Taiwan question, and indeed is acknowledged so to be by Taiwan itself. On the other hand, a more orthodox China, a less flexible China, a less pragmatic China, and a more nationalistic China could be a situation in which the Taiwan issue continues to be a constant irritant in U.S.-China relations. We conclude, finally, with two very blunt statements, which I, for the sake of time, will not try to elaborate. Do we have an interest in the modernization of China? I think we do, for two very simple reasons. That on balance, modernization is more likely to create a China that is a relatively peaceful and flexible actor in international affairs. And secondly, because we have no power to prevent the modernization of China. I put those two together. There is no guarantee, if we cooperate with China, that China will continue on a relatively peaceful and flexible course. However, if we choose not to cooperate with China, there is no guarantee, in fact, the virtual certainty, that China will modernize anyway, and again, a virtual certainty that China will increasingly define its interests hostile to those of the United States. So it's not a matter of certainties, it's a matter of probabilities. But it seems to me the United States is uniquely qualified because of its technology, its historical relations with China, and its distance from Asia to provide a genuinely supportive partner for China's modernization, as long as we do so on realistic and reasonable terms. Should we go the next step and say we clearly also have an interest that reforms succeed in China? Should we do anything that signals a clear choice in the Chinese decision as to whether to follow a reform-minded route or not? And here my answer is no. It seems to me that this is a choice that, again, is going to be one that China makes, that we should make no secret that we would prefer to deal with a reform-minded China for a variety of reasons. But it seems to me that to try to play Chinese politics by trying to support one faction against another is not something that Americans can do effectively or should do in the Chinese case. In general, my approach is to deal relatively even-handedly with the leaders in China, recognizing that there now is a relatively narrow spectrum among them, to say that we are here to support your modernization effort, to share with you our experiences, and to let you draw your own conclusions from them. As I've said, I think there is a good chance that they will continue to choose the reform-minded road, but I'm unfortunately also of the mind that this is not a road that we can decide for them. Thank you very much.
While Dr. Harding gets his breath and perhaps has a drink of water, I'd like to point out that since there's no television camera this evening, it is not necessary to repeat the questions. So Dr. Harding said that he will field the questions himself.
But if you can't hear a question, just say question or wave your hand, and I will repeat it if it's not audible. Yes, sir.
You presented a very eloquent set of scenarios dealing with the alternative path that China is likely to follow into the 21st century. One being the continuation of the modernization path, and the other one being a retraction to a more ideologically driven scenario. But throughout, you made the implicit assumption that the determinant of this one or the other of these two paths is some amorphous notion that you refer to as China. We have seen a dramatic turnaround in the past decade brought about by one man. How do you attribute probabilities to what this next man will be, and what do you see emerging as that? And the implication of my question is that I think it's less China as an amorphous concept driven by national interest or ideology as it is the destiny of a nation being carried by one man, as it has been the case in the past 45 years.
Well, I agree with you completely that to give an analysis of where China is going to go requires that we look inside that black box, which we call China. I'm not sure I would agree with you that in the future it is going to be the course of China is going to be determined as much by the decisions of one man as has been the case in the past. I think that in general we see in political systems, there comes the power back on, and communist systems in particular, over time, a weakening of the power of the single paramount leader. There usually is one. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union is clearly one, the dominant leader, but it's also clear that he has nowhere near the power that Stalin did in his day, or even Khrushchev in his. There's a gradual whittling away of the power of the single leader over time. So, if it's not China collectively deciding, and it's not one man deciding, how does it work? Well, again, all I can suggest is you read my book when it comes out, because that's going to try to answer that question. But let me give you a very brief overview of at least the logic of it. It seems to me that basically there are three factors at work here. First of all is going to be the balance sheet on reform. That is reform producing payoffs for various interests and sectors of Chinese society? And, relatedly, in dealing with the problems created inevitably by reform, is the leadership able to do so in ways that manage the problems effectively without sacrificing the spirit of reform? That's the key. In other words, can they first of all produce some benefits, and can they deal with the liabilities in ways that don't sacrifice the spirit of reform? Because the temptation, the liabilities in general, tend to be the result of liberalization. You liberalize something and it starts doing things that you don't want it to do. The temptation, therefore, is to crack down, but that means to cancel the liberalization, i.e. cancel the reform. So that the trick is to find a way of regulating the problems rather than simply controlling them. My sense is that, first of all, China has encountered some very serious difficulties economically over the last year. But that my sense is that most Chinese would still believe that the balance sheet on reform is positive. That the leadership has been able to find ways of dealing with the problems in a spirit that does not cancel the reforms. And therefore, I am cautiously optimistic, but cautiously. There are serious problems. They're going to get worse. That's going to be the first factor. The second factor is whether or not Deng is able to create a re-engineering of political power in China, in which he tries to change the balance between those who favor reform and those who support it. And I would say again, in general, I am here much more favorably. He's done a remarkable job in changing the balance at the central and provincial apparatus of the party. Again, there are no guarantees, but he has put his followers in clearly majority positions, so that they are able better to ride out economic and social difficulties than if the balance were more even. Now, clearly, a majority can easily become a minority if it can't deal effectively with problems, but at least it gives you some political capital with which to make the attempt. Thirdly is the issue of whether the regime becomes more institutionalized. That is, it becomes, in a sense, more resistant to impetuous change. particularly as a result of the succession. My sense here is that Deng has done virtually everything that is humanly possible to arrange this, but we won't know until it happens, until the succession comes. If we pass through the first one relatively smoothly, then I think China may be pretty home free, as in the Soviet Union, where it's become a very ritualized affair. So that's the kind of analysis that I would give. The technical balance sheet on the reforms, the political balance sheet, the institutionalization of the system, and without going into it any more detail, I am cautiously optimistic that the reforms would continue. Now let me get back to your original premise, which was basically right, but was not quite what I meant to say. So maybe there was a problem. If you didn't hear it the way I meant it, maybe others didn't hear it the way I meant it either. You posed a distinction between modernization on the one hand and a more ideologically driven strategy on the other. My feeling is that that's not the issue. The issue is not an ideologically based strategy, in the same sense that Maoism was, an active utopian ideology. The issue is more within the modernization approach, whether to go a more orthodox Soviet route or to follow a more liberalized strategy. Now, it is true that one impetus towards the more orthodox approach would be ideology, but that is, in a comparative perspective, a historical perspective, not a very ideological approach. It would be, indeed, if we were talking in 10 years ago, we would consider what I consider to be, the kind of the far extreme for China retrogressing. That was the biggest hope for how far China could progress 10 years ago. The spectrum has changed right around it. So I do think the issue is not modernization versus revolution or utopianism, but what kind of modernization. Yes, sir.
We agree that China today is in a very primitive economic way. That you cannot even be looked upon as a world power, given the present economic. I would want to make just one comment. China has achieved two things. One, she stabilized the population, and she has solved her food problem. Everybody eats in China today. Further comment is in regard to the Chinese population and their genuine love for America. The power of rock music, the power of music and the language in China has become so part of the Chinese lifestyle that one can't dismiss it. It is America has received, has been assured in Chinese eyes that a genuine love affair with American music and American culture.
Okay, well, there are two very interesting propositions. One about the love affair with the United States, and the first one about the extent to which China is a power, a major power. The problem in understanding China, the dilemma that one has in understanding China, is the choice one has to make between looking at it in per capita terms or in aggregate terms. You're absolutely right. In per capita terms, China is a developing country at a relatively low level of development. We still don't know with any precision what China's gross national product is, but it's probably around the order of $300, $325 per capita per year, compared with, say, 2,000 or so, approaching 3 on Taiwan, 2,000 in South Korea, about 5 or 6 in Singapore and Hong Kong. That places China fairly low down, around some other Southeast Asian countries, above India, above Bangladesh. On the other hand, if you then multiply that 300 by a billion, you get 300 billion, which is not a small number. $300 billion GNP per year. The size of China's industrial establishment today is the size of Japan's in the 1960s in aggregate terms. So when you multiply a small per capita figure by a huge total population, you get a big number. And I would not say that China is by any means a global power, but I would say that it is a regional power already and has some global reach. That is, we consider it, at least considered it at one point, to be part of a strategic triangle, in some sense equal terms conceptually with the Soviet Union and the United States. It clearly has enough power and enough independence and a geopolitical physical location to be a swing factor in the global balance between the two superpowers. That gives China global reach, even though it is not a global power. So my answer is, when you look at the aggregate, China becomes a regional power with considerable potential for further growth. And if you think it's going to quadruple its GNP by the turn of the century, which is not an unlikely prospect, and it already has some significant influence in global affairs. As to the second question about the love affair, I'll just simply tell you my favorite story about China, and I will not comment on it. Well, there's a comment built in. I'll let you draw your own conclusion. I wish you were right. I hope you're right. I think you're partly right. But love affairs can break apart, and they can also become very stormy. And let me give you an example. When I was in China, one of my earlier trips in December 1978, I stayed at a certain hotel, the name of which and the significance of which will become apparent in a minute or so. And I'm a chronically late morning person. I never get up in the morning. So I was kind of down there finally having my breakfast when all the rest of my group was getting their cameras ready to go to the Great Wall, because that's what we were going to do that day. And the waitress, one of the waitresses came up, young woman, and she knew that I was an American and she knew that I spoke Chinese, so she started talking to me in Chinese, and her first line was, "In America, everything is good, isn't it?" And I kind of dropped my chopsticks, and I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "America, everything is good in America." I said, "Well, why do you say that? We have strong points and weak points like any other country." "No, everything in America is good." And I said, "Where do you get that idea?" She said, "Well, we have lots of overseas Chinese and American visitors, and they tell us everything in America is good." I said, "You shouldn't believe them. It's not true. We have weaknesses like any other." "No. Isn't it true? Every family in the United States has a color television set." Well, that put me back on my heels for a second. I said, "Well, that's not true, actually. Some of them only have black and white." Because virtually every family in America does have a television set. And that didn't impress her as being a major shortcoming of the United States. And then she kind of abruptly changed the subject. She said, on the other hand, in China, everything is crummy. It's the word I use. The word literally translated very lacking. For example, you would have nice restaurants in the United States. You wouldn't eat in a dump like this. She was pointing around at this grand Soviet-style dining room. And I said, "But the food is very good and the service is very good." "No, it's crummy. Everything in China is crummy. Therefore, we must study from you so that we can catch up." Now, that you would come away from that with this feeling that they really are eager to learn from us. There's a love affair with us because we are literally in Chinese the beautiful country. Meiguo means beautiful country. Well, then you have to stop and think of the history of this building. This is the Friendship Hotel, which was built in the 1950s as the apartment complex for Soviet advisors in China, at a time when everything in the Soviet Union was good. And you can imagine this young woman's elder sister or mother or aunt or something dealing with a young slug-a-bed from Moscow and saying, "In the Soviet Union, everything is good, isn't it?" It's true, every collective farm has a machine tractor station. You have nice restaurants in Moscow, you wouldn't eat a dump like this, therefore we have to study from the elder brother Soviet Union so that we can catch up. So my point is, yes, I think there is a love affair with the United States, among some quarters in China. I'm not sure disco is the best example. I'm not sure whether they know where disco comes from. And most of it, a lot of it comes from Hong Kong and Taiwan that they really like. So it's American culture one step removed. But in any event, love affairs can turn sour. Yes, sir.
What is the significance of the new arrangement with the Soviet Union for the China to readmit all the workers that were sent home when they broke the relations in the past?
Okay, I'm not sure that's exactly the agreement, because I think if they admitted all of them, they'd have to send some of them back in coffins. I suspect that some of them have passed from the scene in the intervening 25 years. The Chinese have indeed agreed to allow, to invite a number, we don't know the number, a specified number of Soviet technicians. And as I said before, this is part of a broader pattern that I mentioned before of looking to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as well as the United States and Japan, as a source of trade, technical advice, and advice on restructuring of the economy. I think it is fair to say that, however, the Chinese, the quantity and quality of the relationship between China and the Soviet Union lags very far beyond that with the United States and is likely to continue to do so. Let me just give you some numbers. The total volume of Sino-Soviet trade last year, which was in itself up 64% or so over the year before, the total volume was less than the increase in Sino-American trade last year. Okay? Chinese students and scholars are exchanged by the two sides with the Soviet Union on an equal quid pro quo basis. It amounts to 50 people each way. There are currently on the order of 17,000 Chinese students and scholars in the United States. The cumulative total that have been here and gone home or studied here since 1978 is on the order of 23,000 students and scholars. So it seems to me that, yes, it is significant. I'm not denying the significance. It is significant that China is reestablishing economic ties with the Soviet Union. This reflects what I described earlier as the separation of economics and politics, but there is still a remarkable qualitative difference and quantitative difference between Sino-American and Sino-Soviet relations. I'm not at all concerned about China suddenly reestablishing a Sino-Soviet alliance. I think the issue is independence for China. Will it continue to tilt more towards the West than towards the Soviet Union? And my prediction is that it will. Even if reform should be reversed, it still will see the Soviet Union as a long-term, I'll put it the other way around, the Soviet Union will see China as a long-term geopolitical rival. Yes, we have time for one more.
One more question.
I'll promise to be real brief. Oh, this is rough. This is rough. I'll tell you, you come up and talk to me afterwards, but I already recognize this gentleman, so I'll answer you privately.
Well, I actually have two questions. The first is, how do the Chinese see America? We tend to see ourselves as the benefactor of China, open door policy, go to war for China. They, at least in the 50s, took a very, very different attitude toward America and America's role. The second one is, all of this discussion focused on Chinese foreign policy as if it proceeds from an established country. China has undergone, as you appreciate more than I, an incredible upheaval. Is there, in fact, a stable and liable to persist Chinese political structure? They were in absolute chaos in 1947. They were in appalling chaos in, say, 1975. What would they like to be in 1990?
Okay. Let me deal with the second one first. I think that if China was going to fall apart, it would have fallen apart during the Cultural Revolution. It did not fall apart. And therefore, I think that, yes, I would consider China to have a relatively effective governmental structure. As to whether the policies are going to continue, again, I will just repeat my major point. No, I'm not sure that the specific policies we see are going to continue. But I think the political spectrum has been narrowed considerably. And that the choice, China has gone beyond the Cultural Revolution in ways that you have to talk to Chinese to appreciate. That was such a trauma. It has so discredited the ideas and the people that launched it that it is not going to be repeated. So that we're talking about an uncertainty within a much more limited scope. I wish I'd given a talk on the kind of psycho-cultural basis of U.S.-China relations, because we've gotten two very good questions about it. This one has to do with a slightly different element. One is the question of whether they admire us, and I think they do to a degree, and you're asking the question as to whether they're grateful to us. In part, do they see us as a benefactor?
Well, we
see ourselves as a benefactor. Do the Chinese...
What do they think of us?
Right. I would say that the Chinese, to give a short answer to this, is all I can do. The Chinese see what the United States does as being in the American interest. The assumption is we do it because it is in our interest so to do. The reason I picked on grateful is I'm going to write an article called "The Ungrateful Meet the Unrepentant," which is my version of U.S.-China relations. The Chinese expect us to be sorry for all the things we did, which we tend not to be. We expect them to be grateful for all the things we've done, and they're not. If you list the things that we have done for them and say, what do you think of that? The answer is, we assumed you did it because it was in your interest to do it. Why should we be grateful when you act in your own interest? Now, we may see it as being altruistic. It is not perceived by the Chinese as that, at least collectively. Individually, there may be some sense in our very deep, Chinese form very deep friendships, as many of you know. And there is, I think, within that context, a sense of individual altruism and gratitude. But in terms of the two nations, I think if we assume that the Chinese have unbounded love and admiration for us and are grateful for what we do, to weave these two questions together, I'm afraid we're going to make a terrible mistake. I'm not saying it's the opposite, that they hate us, that they don't admire us, that they think we're corrupt and have nothing to offer, and that we should stay clear. That's not it. Unfortunately, it is horribly ambivalent relationship. I'm sorry.
We have to apologize. Before I formally thank Dr. Harding, I should emphasize the debt of gratitude we have to the Asia Society, which is conducting a study of Northeast Asia, and a team of American scholars have been deeply involved in that, one of whom is Dr. Harding. So that organization, I think, should be noted. Let me amplify on one thing with respect to Vernon Walters. We will not have a substitute for Vernon Walters on the 28th of April, but we will reschedule a date, and he will join this council sometime in the future when his burdens of ambassador at large diminish somewhat, and we all hope that indeed that day does occur. We've been treated to a splendid scholarly evening tonight, and with that nice quality of passion that we like to see in our scholars who love what they do. It's been more than informative, it's been educational, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you.